Here's the MG34 fire control group as used on the Stempel 7645 STG34k. It's a select fire system where pulling the top of the trigger is single shot and pulling the bottom of the trigger is full auto. How it works is, by pulling the trigger in single shot, the sear is depressed, the bolt lunges forward, hits the disconnector piece, the sear then pops up. In full auto, which is down here, pulling the trigger drops the sear. When the bolt comes forward and hits the disconnector piece, the sear just drops down a little bit farther. So the bolt will proceed uninterrupted until the trigger is released, and then the sear comes back up to catch the bolt. So semi, full, and if you notice, the trigger in semi comes back to here, and the trigger in full goes back even farther. And that's because in full auto there is this small lever here which allows the trigger to come back farther. So to take this apart, we use this special punch which has a dome shape built into it. What this does is it starts the pin. It just compresses the two pieces downward slightly. Just to get it started. Then we can take a smaller punch and just follow it through. Carefully driving out because these are under a tremendous amount of spring pressure. Then we'll do the other side. And you see how it's important to start this pin by compressing this dome shape inward, pinching it in so that it can go through the female side of the part. By flipping it around, you can then take the pin out the other side. Sometimes they're pretty stiff, but normally they'll just come right out. So once these two pins are removed, the trigger group, and this is always where you need to be careful because your trigger, once a trigger housing is separated from the receiver, the lower receiver portion of it, the internal components of the trigger can actually just fall out. So you always want to just be aware of what's going on inside of here when you lift this up. So lifting it straight up, you can see the fire control group. And just a note here, these grips are reproduction plastic. Most of the original grips are Bakelite. Bakelite is very brittle, and you always want to work on a padded surface because Bakelite will just chip and fracture, and they are irreplaceable at this point. So what we see here is we can see our sear lever. So when you pull the trigger, it actually actuates this part here, the sear lever. And then you can see the sear on the top. So when the sear lever is actuated, it just drops the sear down. If you notice, the disconnector that we saw earlier is actually part of the trigger group. So this part actually protrudes up in to the lower housing, or in an original MG34 into the receiver to function with the movement of the bolt. So the sear has its own spring, and the sear lever, it just has a pivot pin. The safety, when the safety is brought over to this position, all it does is prevent the sear from moving by interrupting the front of it here. So once the trigger is actually taken off, the safety can be rotated farther and just removed from the side. The fire control group, to take this apart, you always want to maintain control of the parts because there's a lot of parts in here. If you pull down on the D, what will happen is this part will start to come up. And gently lifting this out, and see it actually launched the, this is your trigger spring, and this is your trigger spring seat. This is what provides pressure on the linear movement of the trigger because this isn't a pivoting trigger when you pull it. It's actually just straight back and forth. This is your connecting rod. So this part right here is what's actually pushing on the sear lever. So every time you pull the trigger, this is the part here that is pushing on your sear lever here. So by pulling the trigger, you're moving that Sear lever. And this is your trigger spring and your trigger spring seat. This part pulls out, and you notice there's a step here, right there. Well, that step interacts with the disconnector, and this is how the select fire system is accomplished. If you see when your disconnector is tripped in full auto, it will connect with this plunger here and allow it to push on the Sear lever. In semi-auto, when this disconnector is tripped, this part is pushed forward. And then once the trigger is released, it goes forward and then it reconnects to then actuate the system. So keep in mind that there's a compression spring here, there's a compression spring here. These all need to be checked for freedom of movement. Taking these apart involves some very small punches. So normally it's a good idea to blow them out after use, make sure there's nothing clogged in there. If not, you might end up having to disassemble them eventually, especially if you're shooting suppressed with our subguns, because there will be buildup down in here. I actually see a little bit coming off on my hand. To reassemble this, and notice this little step is upward. We're going to have that fully compressed, so these two parts are together. This is one of the earlier type triggers, which has a spring seat stop to it. And what we're going to do is we need to work that trigger down on this surface right here. See if we can get a good look at that. There's a little square cut out here, and that's where we need this spring stop to be. So sometimes it helps to actually take a small punch or tool and compress that spring seat slightly. But what I'm going to try and do is I'm just going to try and rock it into place. And I got it in. And the back of this, if you notice, there's a little round part, if we can get it here, on the back of the connecting rod that goes into another pocket in here. You always want to make that that part gets into the pocket. So the trigger, when you have the trigger here, you'll see that it actually sits flush with the top of the assembly. To take out the Sear and the Sear lever, you just drive out the pins. There's a spring here, which again, it's a compression spring, and it's always a good idea to, if you're not going to disassemble it and brush it out, it's a good idea to at least blow it out, because anytime debris can build up in that pocket, it can impede movement, and then the system just won't function. You'll pull the trigger and nothing will happen. Or you'll pull the trigger and it can just run away on you if it doesn't have proper movement. So once this is all back together, you have to be very important to, it's very important to make sure that this connecting rod lands in front of the Sear lever. So it's always good to start this a little bit forward and rock it back. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the Sear lever right in this little back pocket here, right in here. And before you do that, just an aside, if your connecting rod is all the way back, you won't be able to assemble it. So you always have to push the connecting rod forward, and to push the disconnector up to get it all the way forward is a good idea. And it will just fall back on gravity, so you do need to keep it at a slight angle forward. So I can see that I've lined myself up here. It's usually a good idea to put the safety in first. I'll put in the the female pins first. And if something isn't going, you never want to force it. It means there's a misalignment. So now the female pins are in. I can put in the male pins. And to get these in, you need to support the female pins on the back, and then rock the male pins into place. It's sometimes, especially if you have a fresh pin, it does take a little bit to get started, and you can just push them into place. Function check, pull the trigger, actuate the disconnector. It trips up on semi. In full, it stays down. Thanks for watching. So to fully disassemble the lower assembly of the STG34k blower, it is a little bit different than an MG34. We use retaining screws to hold in the Sear and the Sear lever pins. And we do this because the reproduction grips have a slightly different shape than the original MG34 grips and do not retain these pins. So what I'm undoing are the two set screws that retain these pins. And this is the 5/64 key wrench that's supplied. So once these screws are backed off slightly, the pins can just be removed, similar to the MG34. So I can just take this. They shouldn't be very tight. So I can just push them out. And I caught the Sear pin on the other side. So here's the Sear and here's the Sear spring. And the spring sits on the surface here. If I remove the safety by pivoting it over and pulling it out, you can better see the surface that the Sear spring sits on. And this pin, it has a shape on it, so it can only go in one way. It goes in all the way, and then the set screw, screwing it down, will lock it in place. So it goes in through the left side, comes out through the left side. Same deal with the Sear lever pin. The Sear lever pin has a head on it, and the Sear lever does not have its own spring. So it's a good idea to occasionally take this apart, clean out any debris built up on this surface and this surface, especially around the Sear lever, because the Sear lever is what actually controls the movement of the Sear. If there's a buildup of debris on the surface, it'll impede the movement of the Sear lever, and you might not get good enough Sear contact. To remove the buffer assembly, you first have to remove the stock. The multi-tool is fitted to the stock screw. When you're using the gun, it's important that the stock screw is tight, because it'll keep your stock tight. So once the screw is removed, the keeper can be pushed out of the left side. It's all by hand. There's no tools required to remove that. Once the keeper is removed, the stock can just be pulled from the rear. At this point, you can see they just came out. There's two 5/32 pins that retain the buffer. You notice the buffer does rock slightly, and that's by design. It's important that this buffer rock upward, so when you're assembling the gun, the spring can guide over and the receiver can actually seat over this buffer area, and you can see the buffer has a slight taper to it. So it comes in and snaps down on this assembly. When it's all locked in, there is no movement in it. But once the stock is taken off, there's nothing holding these screws in, and they can just be these pins. They can just be shaken out or just pushed out with a small punch, and the buffer can be removed. Typically, there's no reason to take this apart unless you want to replace this buffer pad, maybe clean out this hole. You clean out under here, you can see sometimes some dust just settles in. But under normal circumstances, there's really no need to take this apart. So to reassemble, we're just going to line up our buffer with the holes in the lower assembly, using our finger on the other side to make sure they don't fall out. Put the stock over the area, align the stock with the holes on the left side for the keeper plate, push the keeper plate in, hold that in place with my finger on the other side, put in the stock screw by hand, and then finish off by tightening with a multi-tool. And always give an extra bit of torque there to make sure it's nice and tight.